March 4, 1944, 10:47 a.m. Over Berlin, veteran Luftwaffe pilots were about to witness something military intelligence manuals declared impossible. A silhouette on the horizon. Altitude 8,500 meters, distance from nearest base, 100 kilometers. The calculations were clear. No American fighter had the range to be there, but it was. And within minutes, that silhouette would reveal a devastating truth. The war Germany believed it could win had just ended. The Second Air War had become a game of dominance. Since the beginning of the American daylight bombing offensive, the Luftwaffe had developed a narrative of superiority, at least at home, at least over German territory. The pilots patrolling the skies over Berlin weren't recruits. They were veterans, men who had been flying since 1939, men with hundreds, some even thousands of flight hours, men who knew every attack pattern, every tactic of the P-47s and P-38s the Americans sent as escorts. These fighters believed in their supremacy. They had reason to believe. In the past 2 years, they had shot down hundreds of bombers. The records were there. The confirmations were there. The burials too. The routine was predictable. Simple mathematics. Radars alerted them to approaching American bomber formations. German pilots climbed, gaining altitude rapidly. The B-17s and B-24s came at a constant, predictable, defensible speed. The escorts. German intelligence had the numbers memorized. P-47 Thunderbolt, maximum range of 1,000 kilometers. P-38 Lightning, 200 kilometers at most. Berlin was 100 kilometers from London. And then there was the return flight. The math was clear. The Americans could defend the bombers over Germany for perhaps 10 minutes. After that, the fighters would have to turn back. The bombers would be alone, vulnerable. And then the massacre would happen. That was the doctrine. That was the certainty that dominated morning briefings. The laughter at air bases. The confidence of men who believed they had figured out the enemy's limitations. But on the morning of March 4th, something changed. Radio transmission started early. Radars detected a massive bomber formation. It wasn't unusual. The Luftwaffe scrambled its pilots. Bf-109s and FW-190s took off from runways around Berlin. Engines roared. Pilots felt the familiar acceleration, that sense of total control when the aircraft demanded more, and the sky opened up. As they climbed, German pilots could see the bombers below in their box formations. Perfect, predictable. Around them, the smaller shadows of fighter escorts. Combat always started this way: visual identification, approach, attack. The procedures were engraved in their bones. Then initial contact happened. German pilots identified the escorts. They were fighters, that was certain, but there was something different about them. Different from the silhouettes they expected, different from known patterns. Some whispered about P-47s, others suggested P-38s. It made sense. It had to make sense. But as the distance decreased, as German pilots could see better, reality began to make no sense. The fuselage was longer than a P-47, but not as bulky as a P-38. The wing profile was distinct, and there was something about the canopy design, the way the aircraft cut through the sky. An experienced pilot, veteran of hundreds of combats, whispered to his wingman, "That's a P-51. The response came sharply over the radio. Impossible. The math doesn't allow it. But the math was wrong there over Berlin, hundreds of meters above them. Multiple squadrons of them, P-51 Mustangs, the same fighters that, according to German intelligence range calculations, should at that exact moment be returning to England with empty tanks. The silence on the radio lasted only a few seconds, but for those pilots it felt like an eternity. The reality forming in their minds was so disturbing they could barely process it. If the P-51s were here, then everything they believed was wrong. If the P-51s were here, then there was no more refuge at home. If the P-51s were here, then the Luftwaffe no longer controlled its own airspace. Veteran pilots recognized what this meant immediately. Their gun sights had already calculated the implications. If the P-51's range had been extended enough to reach Berlin, then theories about German air supremacy vanished like smoke. Combat attempts began immediately. German pilots applied known tactics. They tried to gain altitude, a move that had worked against the less agile P-47s, but the P-51 responded. It climbed with them. Not just kept pace, but seemed to their horror to gain altitude more efficiently. They tried spiral combat cycles. The P-51 cut inside them. They tried steep dives. The P-51 dove faster, with greater control. The first casualties fell within minutes, not in half a dozen strategic engagements. In quick, efficient, brutal attacks, pilots who had stayed alive through 5 years of war were shot down in their own skies. Over the next few hours, the harsh reality spread through the radio frequencies. Message after message, pilot after pilot confirming what no one wanted to believe. The P-51s were over Berlin. The P-51s were over Frankfurt. The P-51s were everywhere. German officers listened to the transmissions at their command posts. Some realized immediately. The war had changed. Perhaps, just perhaps, Germany had already lost. But what was the secret? How had the Americans broken the mathematics that the Luftwaffe considered inviolable? The answer wasn't in a technological revolution. It was in a series of modifications that German engineers never anticipated. Small changes that, combined, transformed a good fighter into an extraordinary fighter. An aircraft that couldn't just escort bombers to Berlin, but could do so while outperforming the best German fighters in nearly every metric that mattered. But before we could understand how everything changed, we need to understand what came before. We need to know the P-51 that arrived at war. And we need to know its limitations, because it was exactly in those limitations that the Americans found opportunity. So while that German pilot saw that dot on the horizon, and recognition came instantly, the reality of disaster materializing. Before his eyes, something was happening in American engineering offices that would forever change the history of modern aviation. It was no longer a slow bomber, like those the Luftwaffe had destroyed for years. It wasn't the old P-47 Thunderbolt, with its sturdy fuselage and limited range. It was something completely different. It was the Mustang. And that moment in March 1944, as the pilot watched that silhouette approaching at altitudes where German fighters had dominated for so long, was when the reality of disaster finally materialized. Because the truth that no one had adequately communicated to Luftwaffe pilots was simpler than any war tactic. The P-51 Mustang didn't win through courage or tactics. It won because it was objectively, undeniably superior in virtually every dimension that mattered in aerial combat. And it all started with an engine. In the beginning, the Mustang was a promising fighter, but with a critical problem. The Americans equipped it with an Allison V1710 engine, a reliable but weak engine. It produced only 100 horsepower. It was insufficient. Tests showed the aircraft had potential, but lacked the brute force to compete at high altitudes. American engineers analyzed the performance and reached a harsh conclusion. The Mustang, as it was, had no future against top-tier German fighters. But then someone had an idea that would completely change the history of aerial combat. And this idea was too simple to seem true. Put a British engine in it. The British had the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This wasn't just any engine. The Merlin had 1,090 horsepower, almost 400 horses more than the original American engine. No one in the Luftwaffe realized this was the hack they were about to face. The engine was installed, and the P-51 Mustang was transformed. The P-51D was born, and no one would have any idea what was coming. But it wasn't just the engine, there was more. American engineers, especially in the aviation industry, understood something fundamental about flight. Air doesn't want to be cut. It wants to flow. They redesigned the fuselage to allow laminar flow over the wings. They reduced aerodynamic drag on every inch of the aircraft. Every rivet, every panel, every curve was optimized. It was watchmaker precision applied to aviation engineering. The result was a Mustang that could reach 437 miles per hour at sea level. Their German rivals, the best they had, the Bf-109G could manage 386 miles per hour. The FW-190A, considered an exceptional fighter, reached 408 miles per hour. The difference was a gap, a chasm. And in aerial combat, 20 or 30 miles per hour more means the power to choose when to fight, when to flee, and when to attack. But the Merlin engine and refined aerodynamics were only part of the story. There was another revelation that Luftwaffe pilots discovered when trying to understand why their rivals could fly so far. The Americans had developed a system of external fuel tanks, tanks that could be dropped in the air when empty. This wasn't a theoretical innovation. It was brutal engineering practice. A Bf-109, the fighter defending Berlin, had a flight range of only 528 kilometers with its internal fuel. It was a defensive fighter, designed to protect cities for short patrols for combat close to home. An FW-190 was little better, with 497 kilometers of range, but the P-51 Mustang with its external tanks could fly over 1,050 kilometers. It could travel from bases in England to Berlin, fight and return. This was impossible for the Germans to comprehend in the early months. Altitude also revealed the superiority. The Mustang could reach 41,900 feet altitude. The Bf-109G could only reach 38,500 feet. The FW-190A 37,400 feet. Those 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet made a difference in aerial warfare. Difference means survival. And during the spring and summer months of 1944, that difference began to turn into carnage. The Luftwaffe pilots were no fools. They were experienced men, veterans of years of combat over the European continent. Men like Obergefreiter Rudolf Heinemann, flying his grey Bf-109 machine since before dawn to intercept the bombers, knew that something had fundamentally changed. They quickly understood that they couldn't compete in raw speed. So they did what any desperate pilot would do. They innovated with what they had. Some tried to exploit the Germans' altitude advantage by using their engines to gain height quickly and occupy the high altitudes before the Mustangs arrived. If they could be above, perhaps the initial burst of fire, that first touch of cannon, might work. Some achieved a 5,000-foot advantage, waiting above the clouds. But the Mustang kept climbing. It kept going and going until it was above them, too. It was desperation against inevitability. Other pilots tried to exploit weight. The Bf-109 was lighter. If they were fast enough in a dive, maybe they could separate the Mustang from its formation and force it into individual combat where maneuver and agility might matter. There were stories of occasional successes. Oberleutnant Heinz Baer, an elite pilot with dozens of kills, could sometimes use his skills to shake off pursuers. But these victories were exceptions. They were stories that pilots told each other on cold spring nights, stories that meant, perhaps we still have a chance. The Luftwaffe reorganized its tactics. Formations of 4 were increased to 6 to 8. Pilots were instructed to never, absolutely never, attempt traditional combat against an isolated Mustang. If they encountered one, the instruction was clear. Gain altitude, seek rough terrain, approach from behind and toward friendly bases. And if there were many Mustangs, the answer was even simpler: run. But the pilots' stories told different tales from those in the tactics manual. There was Hauptmann Walter Dahl, an ace with 41 kills, who could sometimes outmaneuver Mustangs in tight maneuvers near the ground. There was Hauptmann Klaus Neumann, who claimed to have kept a Mustang engaged for 10 minutes in combat, testing its limits, searching for the crack in the technical armor. These victories were desperate, magnificent in their rarity. The statistics, however, told an unambiguous story. German records showed that in the first months of extensive combat against the Mustangs, Luftwaffe pilots were losing 3 pilots for every Mustang brought down. Some months the ratio worsened, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. German pilots knew they were being shot down at rates their numbers could never sustain. Each day, fewer pilots returned. Each day, more stories of comrades disappearing from formations. Hauptmann Gerd Barkhorn, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces with up to 102 claimed kills, fell victim to Mustangs 3 times, when his machine was damaged in combat. He managed to eject all 3 times, but the message was crystal clear. Not even the best could easily escape the P-51 if circumstances weren't perfect. And then there was the problem no tactic could solve: the numbers. The Americans were producing Mustangs in industrial quantities, while the Luftwaffe tried to find ways to fight more efficiently with its dwindling numbers of experienced pilots. The Americans were assembling 200, 300, 400 Mustangs per month in factories that operated without interruption. In March 1944, when that pilot saw the Mustang approaching from the horizon above Berlin, he was seeing not just a superior aircraft. He was seeing history being rewritten in real time. He was seeing that the advantage the Luftwaffe had held for 4 years, air dominance, tactical superiority, experienced pilots, was being erased by a machine that was simply better at almost everything that mattered. The heroism of German pilots didn't disappear. They continued fighting, continued claiming victories, continued testing the limits of their machines and their skills. But what became clear in March 1944 was that heroism would not be enough. No amount of courage, tactical creativity, or flying skill could overcome 400 more horsepower, half a ton more range, and the ability to produce 1,000 of these aircraft per month. German commanders began writing memos. "The Mustang is superior in all aspects of combat," wrote one officer in a confidential report circulating among commanders. "Our tactics must focus on escape and protection of vital points. Aerial victory against this aircraft is beyond the capabilities of our units." But there was something larger that no memo could adequately capture. There was something in the air, literally in the air, that pilots felt every time they saw that dot on the horizon approaching. It was the glimpse of a future they didn't need tactics to achieve. They just needed continuous production, fuel, and time. And time, as everyone knew, was running out. But what that German pilot saw in the Berlin sky that day wasn't just an isolated event. It was the reflection of a strategic shift that had been underway for months. And now suddenly it was becoming visible, undeniable. Back to Luftwaffe headquarters, the commanders faced an increasingly harsh reality. American bombers were penetrating deep into Germany, not occasionally, routinely, daily. And now this penetration came accompanied by an escort they couldn't defeat. The P-51 Mustang had transformed what was impossible into inevitable. Before March 1944, long-range bombing missions were a matter of survival by numbers. The Americans lost hundreds of bombers, sometimes in a single mission. In Schweinfurt in October 1943, they lost 60 bombers in one day. In Regensburg, they lost 147. The cost was horrific, and the question American commanders faced was always the same. Could they continue paying this price? Could they send men to die in such proportions? Then came the P-51 with extended fuel tanks, and everything changed. In the first weeks of March, the change became evident in the numbers. Yes, bombers were still lost. But now they were losses, not massacres. Where before they lost 1 in 10, now they lost 1 in 20. A few months later, it would be 1 in 30. German fighter pilots continued fighting ferociously. They remained experienced warriors, but now they were at a disadvantage. And that meant the bombers could get through. They would reach their targets. They would bomb German industry. In the Luftwaffe command offices, this reality pressed on every decision. Adolf Galland, the leader of German fighters, faced an impossible choice. Use his limited pilots and fuel to defend the airspace now, or conserve resources for a final technological gamble. Because there was a plan. There was always a plan in the minds of German commanders. There was the Me-262, the jet fighter, the aircraft that, in theory, could change everything again. But theory and reality were in mortal conflict. Development of the Me-262 had begun years earlier, but now it had to be accelerated. They had to be ready. They had to count on it. Because propeller pilots could no longer win against the P-51, the Me-262 program was placed on maximum priority. Resources were diverted. Factories were reorganized. Men who built bombers now built jet fighters. Resources that could have been used to defend in 1944 were invested in a hope for 1945. It was a gamble they couldn't afford to lose. But meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had to keep fighting with what it had. And what it had was dying. Training numbers collapsed. New pilots arrived at units with perhaps 50 hours of flight time. Veteran pilots had 500. There was a monstrous difference, and now those new pilots, with 50 hours of experience, were being sent to face American pilots with 300 hours of combat time, flying aircraft that were equal or superior to their own. Many of these new German pilots died in the first week. The Luftwaffe's population of qualified pilots wasn't just diminishing, it was collapsing. Meanwhile, American factories operated at full capacity. Between 1943 and the end of 1944, the United States produced 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. 15,000. Germany in the same period produced hundreds against 15,000. It was a ratio that admitted no illusion. Strategic reports reached German commanders month after month. Official assessments documented the shift. Military analysts calculated when American air superiority would be complete. When it would be, not if, when. The numbers spoke a language that no patriotic speech could contradict, and that language was organizational collapse in real time. But among the pilots who continued flying, there was a kind of silent resolve. They knew. Many of the experienced German pilots knew the war was lost. They had known since March 1944. They knew by the simple fact of having seen those P-51s over Berlin, escorting the bombers to the heart of the Reich. That meant nothing could stop them. There could be no successful interception of the complete bomber fleet. They could shoot down some, but others would get through. They would continue. They would bomb. They would destroy. This realization didn't paralyze the German pilots. On the contrary, in many cases, it made their actions more personally meaningful, more desperate perhaps, but also more respectable. Because now they were flying knowing they couldn't win. They were flying because it was their duty. Because it was the right thing to do. Because their counterparts in the US would do the same. This is a different form of heroism. Not the heroism of victory. The heroism of defeat with dignity. Accounts from German pilots after the war speak of the moment when hope withered. Many cite precisely this period, the spring of 1944, when the P-51 began appearing in consistent protective squadrons. A German pilot named Walter Schuck wrote that, "From that moment I knew the war was over. Not in the short term. The war itself lost, I knew it was lost. This was the recognition of a turning point. A moment when possibility transformed into inevitability. And that moment began on March 4, 1944, when German pilots took off, knowing there were P-51s in the operational zone. That there would be, routinely. What the P-51 did wasn't just win dogfights, it changed the structure of air power in Europe. It made the bombers unstoppable. That meant industrial Germany was now doomed. It meant the development of new technological weapons had to be accelerated, or the war was lost. It meant pilot training had to be intensified, while scarce resources were diverted to future technology. It meant every decision was in conflict with all the others. The P-51 didn't win the war alone. No weapon does. But the P-51 accelerated the war's conclusion by months, perhaps by more than a year, because it made continuous defense of German airspace impossible. And without air control, there is no industry. Without industry, there is no army. This was fully understood by German strategists in 1944. Their response, the desperate acceleration of the Me-262, was an admission of that reality. If today's tactical technology didn't work, they had to invent tomorrow's radical technology. It had to be before it was too late. It wasn't. The Me-262 would arrive too late and in insufficient numbers. When it flew in combat, it had lost critical years. The opportunity to change the war's trajectory had passed, but that was still in the future. In March 1944, what German pilots knew was that something fundamental had changed. The enemy had found the formula for air victory: long-range escort, continuous protection, equality or superiority in aircraft quality, overwhelming numbers, all of this converging in a single place, the sky over Germany. That's the legacy of March 4, 1944. It wasn't the day the war was won, but it was the day it was lost, truly, finally, irreversibly. Military history scholars still study that day. German veterans still talk about it, and the way they talked about it, with a mixture of respect and resignation, says everything about what it meant to be there, to understand in that instant that the world had changed. Since then, military doctrines have evolved. Modern air superiority is understood as impossible without fighter escort. It's an axiom now, but it became an axiom because it was proven in blood, in fuel, in production, in limited resources. It became an axiom because those German pilots had to learn the lesson the hardest way possible. History often teaches us that innovation and technology are decisive, and to some extent they are. The P-51 was technologically superior, but perhaps the real lesson is different. Perhaps it's this: when facing a challenge, even a challenge that seemed insurmountable, human beings find the solution. Not always, but when they do, when they recognize the moment when something changed permanently, it's a moment that marks history. March 1944 was that moment when German pilots looked to the sky and saw defeat flying in organized squadrons. If moments like this fascinate you, those historical pivots where everything changes, where one person's innovation or a concept redirects the course of events, we have much more. Stories of engineers who saved cities, pilots who changed wars, quiet moments when someone understood the world would never be the same. Subscribe to the channel. Because every week we have a new story of how an idea, a machine, a person changed everything. Next week we return to World War II, but this time we focus on an invasion that was nearly prevented by a weapon the Germans kept secret. A weapon the Allies didn't know existed until it was too late. How was it discovered? How was it neutralized? And how misinformation saved thousands of lives? Subscribe so you don't miss it.